I would like to formally begin this meeting. This is a collaborative webinar between the CoHaB Indian Diaspora Centre and the University of Mumbai Centre for Excellence in Maritime Studies. This is our first collaborative venture, and we have called this webinar the Indian Ocean as Memory Space, the Indian Diaspora in Mauritius, East and South Africa. Before I hand over the proceedings to the chair of today's meeting, Professor Anuradha Majumdar, the in-charge director of the Center for Excellence in Maritime Studies, a few words about our topic, the selection of the topic, the Indian Ocean as Memory Space. Memory space actually comes from, it's an English translation of a French term called lieu de mémoire, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. I know we have got some French speakers, including Sushila Gopal, online. It's a concept which is related to collective memory, and it states that this concept of collective memory, or memory space as we call it in English, states that this is a concept concerned with places, objects, or events which have a special significance related to that particular group's remembrance or memories. And the term was coined by a French historian, Pierre Nora, who actually, I'm quoting him, said that it is a complex thing. This lieu de mémoire is a complex thing, and it's at once natural and artificial. So the spaces that you talk about, the concepts you talk about, the things you talk about could be natural, concerned with the natural world, or they could be artificial, they could be simple, or they could be ambiguous, could be concrete, or they could be abstract, very French theoretician kind of definition that Monsieur Nora, Professor Nora has given us. And this is where this term, memory space, comes from. And a lot of us working in diaspora studies today have been picking up this idea of memory spaces. And there are a lot of projects which have been started in different universities around the world concerned with memory spaces and the diaspora and its memory spaces. Now, as far as we are concerned, the Indian diaspora is concerned, the Indian Ocean is one such memory space, simple, complex, ambiguous, everything that Professor Nora has said really applies to the Indian Ocean as a memory space. It's a space, it's a site in which not just the memories of the British colonial period indentured or free diaspora descendants are connected, but also collective memories that go back beyond the British colonial period. Now, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because maritime communities from India's western and also eastern coast for over 4,000 years have engaged in trade and commerce with the Persian Gulf, the African coast, and also further southeast into the Southeast Asian countries. And the ancient cities of Dholavira and Lothal, which were thriving ports on our lost river Saraswati in the ancient Harappan civilization period, which are now landlocked. Both the cities are landlocked. But they had carried on, in their times, they had carried on a thriving trade with ancient Mesopotamia, with Iran, with Sumer, and further down the African coast. The Gujarat, Malabar, and Coromandel coast merchants traded with the Arab world and East African spaces. And through these ports of Africa and the Arab world, our goods, Indian goods, had reached the European world. Not goods or only culture, civilization, languages, artifacts, coins had reached the European world. All along the Indian coast, in addition to that, all along the Indian coastline, shipbuilding was a thriving industry. And the ships built in India competed with those built by the Chinese for trade in the Indian Ocean. The Chinese had a very peculiar way of building their ships, and the Indian ships, the dhows and the ancestors of the dhows, were all again built in a very particular manner, unique to those shipbuilders. Incidentally, that shipbuilding industry still thrives in Gujarat ports like Mandvi. Now, the navies of the rulers of the Malabar and Coromandel coasts had first tangled with the Arabs and then the Portuguese and other European powers for the protection of their maritime trade routes and settlements along the African coast and the Arab coast. During the Mughal and European colonial period, the Maratha kingdom established its own naval traditions and also shipbuilding industries along the western coast of India. Major sea battles were fought by the Maratha Navy with the Portuguese and the British. However, unlike the earlier navies of the rulers of the Coromandel coast and the Malabar coast, these navies, the Maratha navies, were not sea navies, but coastal navies. And what the naval historians would call, they were green navies and not blue sea navies. Therefore, one can see that there's a very old tradition of seafaring, maritime trade, naval warfare and conquest, as well as diplomacy, exchange of culture and religions in not just the Indian Ocean, but even further down. I mean, of course, the Indian Ocean is a huge space if you're talking about the memory space, but we are only concerning ourselves with the western part of the Indian Ocean, which flows between the African coast and the Indian coast. But the Indian Ocean touches the Australian western coast and it goes right down to the Antarctic continent. So it is a very huge space. Maybe some other day we could speak about those spaces as well. And we have the CEMAS, the Center for Excellence in Maritime Studies, with us. Maybe they would have some ideas about that. Now, in colonial times, the older Indian diaspora, going back to these pre-colonial times, had been augmented by the indentured labor diasporas in Mauritius, Seychelles, East and South Africa. And along with the indentured labor, Indian traders and professionals like our Mahatma Gandhi himself had also settled once again in these spaces, creating their own memory sites there. Much research is being done, as I've said already, around the world today on the Indian Ocean and its connection with the Indian diaspora. The Indian government, in fact, has its own project called MOSAM. And that, again, MOSAM, of course, refers to the monsoon winds, which were used by the traders to sail from the Indian side of the Indian Ocean to the African and Arab sides of the Indian Ocean. One such research project, I've said there are many research projects, and one such research project called the Indian Ocean as Memory Space is situated at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, with which we at CoHaB IDC had just a couple of years back, 2 years back, in fact, held a joint conference on Afro-Asian relations, Afro-Asian diasporas. Now, they too, the Frankfurt University has collaborated with us on had collaborated with us on this conference. And we have also been collaborating with them on bringing out a special issue of a journal that they edit called Matatu, and we are co-editing that with them. So we have a collaboration with the Goethe University Frankfurt in this area of the Indian Ocean memory space. Now, today's webcast, as I have said, has the collaboration of the Center for Excellence in Maritime Studies, a newly established center at the Mumbai University, which is offering an MA, MCom, as well as an MSc in Maritime Studies. We are very happy that the in-charge director of the center is with us as the chair, not just the collaborator, but is chairing this session for us. And we are sure that we'll have a fruitful discussions with the speakers after the speakers have spoken. And also we look forward to having future collaborative events with the CEMS. It's very, very appropriate that we have the CEMS because they are a Maritime Studies Center, and this webinar is focused on the Indian Ocean, maritime space as a memory space for the study of Indian diasporics. And of course, we have got our three speakers are all from these, all three are from these memory spaces. They represent diverse colonial diasporas in the Indian Ocean space. We have Advocate Feroz Nauroji from Kenya. We have Kanya Padyachi from South Africa, and we have Dr. Sushila Gopal from Mauritius. And they are also old friends of CoHaB IDC and have participated in our pre-pandemic international conferences in Mumbai and in Kutch. And they have also been with us as speakers and as discussants on our online webinar since the beginning of the pandemic. And I welcome all the three speakers who will be introduced at the end by our chair to this webinar. Of course, I have already welcomed Professor Majumdar, but before I hand over the proceedings to her, I would very briefly like to introduce Professor Majumdar to you. And it's my pleasure to not just welcome her, but to introduce her to you. And then she will take over the proceedings, introduce the speakers, and then the matter is in her hands. All right. Now, Dr. Majumdar, Anuradha Majumdar, is the Dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of Mumbai. And she has more than 23 years of experience as an academician and a scientist. She has a B.Pharm and M.Pharm from Nagpur University and a PhD Tech from the University of Mumbai. She was conferred with the gold medal by the Nagpur University for coming first in the order of merit at M.Pharm. Dr. Majumdar's areas of specialization are pharmacology, and she has been a faculty in the Bombay College of Pharmacy, and her research area is neuropharmacology, metabolic pharmacology, and novel drug delivery systems. Her research thrust is on mitochondrial dysfunction in diseases and disorders. She has several patents, publications, book chapters, and international publications to her credit. Dr. Majumdar has successfully completed a significant number of government-sponsored projects, including AICTE, BRNS, DAE, DBT, BIRAC. I'm sorry about these acronyms, but maybe she can enlighten us about them at some point. DBT and UGC major, etc. She's a consultant to pharmaceutical and allied industries and has completed several industry-sponsored projects. Recently, her proof of concept on a drug delivery system platform has been selected by Cipla Limited in its Innoventia drive and taken up by the company for further development. Congratulations, Dr. Majumdar. She has taken up the mantle of Dean Science and Technology since more than a year and has worked absolutely with dedication and sincerity. We know that the coming up of the center, how hard Dr. Majumdar has worked, not just for the center, but creating benchmarks of academics and research in science and technology at the University of Mumbai. So Dr. Majumdar, the platform is yours. Please take over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nilufar Bharucha, for the kind introduction. I think it's more about the diaspora today. So greetings from the CoHaB Indian Diaspora Centre and the Centre of Excellence in Maritime Studies to all who've joined us today. And indeed, it's my privilege to be part of this webinar. When Professor Nilufar wrote to me, I felt elated, and it is indeed a privilege and an advantage of CEMAS, which is fledgling and nascent now, to leverage on the strengths of the CoHaB Centre and the eminence and the great network which Professor Nilufar already has, and her expertise in the field. So indeed, today the speakers are diasporic in the true sense, and very unique narratives of all the three speakers are expected. They are representatives or are representation of India and the Indian ethos in foreign lands. So I was just wondering what to say. As you could make out, I'm from the pharma field, and when Professor Nilufar gave me this task, I was a bit daunted and a bit, worried that I should not make a fool of myself in front of all you eminent people. So I think it also showcases the grit, the struggle, the liberation, and the sustenance of the Indian diaspora in these distant lands. The Indian diaspora prevailed, not only sustained, they prevailed and contributed to the development of their adopted countries. The current diaspora, which is probably the second or third generation post-migration of their forefathers, are well entrenched in society and have made a mark for themselves in their respective countries of birth.
Yeah.
Please request people to mute their mics, please. Thank you. Sorry, Anuradha.
So as I would just repeat that the second or the third generation diaspora are the ones who are well entrenched in the society and the community of the countries of birth. And they have made a great mark for themselves, which is evident from the short bios provided for all the three speakers. The collective memories which we will hear today draws the trajectory, the evolution, the status, the contributions of our diasporas in these parts of the world. The common thread, as Professor Nilufar mentioned some time back with a lot of explanation in a scientific sense, as the topic goes, the Indian Ocean as memory space, the Indian diaspora in Mauritius, East and South Africa. So the common thread here is the magnanimous Indian Ocean, the ripples of memory of our diasporas, and the waves of transformation witnessed by the Indian Ocean as the memory space is what I call it. If we see, because we have three speakers from Mauritius and one from Mauritius, two from the African countries, the Indian laborers between 1834 to 1920 migrated to Mauritius and the Fallacy Ghat, is it right? In the harbor of Port Louis on the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius. So that is evident that the major exodus and flux of people from India to these parts of the world was from via the sea. Similarly, following the creation of the British East Africa Protectorate in 1895, there has been a migration of Indian laborers between 1896 to 1901, which were recruited to construct the Uganda Railway, the line which linked the interiors of Uganda and Kenya with the Indian Ocean port of Mombasa in Kenya. Others had arrived earlier by sea as traders. So they had to, the people there who migrated as laborers had to work their way to freedom. There are more than, what is being said is more than 3 million people of Indian origin in Africa today. So let's hear the narratives of three of our eminent diasporas through the ripples of time, witnessed by the ripples and the waves of the Indian Ocean. So the first speaker, whom I think I heard in the last session of Professor Nilufar, is Advocate Firoz Nauroji. He is a senior counsel, is an advocate of the High Courts of Kenya, Tanzania, and Zanzibar. He has also appeared in the High Courts of Uganda and Seychelles. Born in the diaspora in Nairobi, He studied in India, that is BA in the University of Bombay, way back in 1957. So he's an alumnus of our university. Great to have you, sir. In the UK of Lincoln Inn Barrister 1965, and in the USA LLM at Yale 1974. What a trajectory. His awards include the International Commission of Jurists from Kenya, ICJ Jurist of the Year 1995, the International Bar Association IBA Bernard Simmons Human Rights Prize 2002 to 2004, the Law Society of Kenya Roll of Honor 2005, the Maasai People Safeguarding Rights Award 2007, and the C.V. Madan Constitution Prize 2014. His family has been a part of the diaspora since 1896. He has been awarded the Bharatiya Pravasi Samman Award 2007 by India. He has given the South Asian Studies Council's annual Gandhi lecture at Yale University in 2017. He is the author of A Kenyan Journey, a rumination on the diaspora in East Africa, and the Dukawala short story set there. He's a BBC Africa Poetry Competition Prize winner. So what an eclectic personality, so many traits, really envious of all the traits which you have in one personality. So over to you, Advocate Feroz.
You are muted.
You are on mute.
Okay. Yep. Thanks. The title of the lecture is Rights of Memory and Erasure, Coolie History in Kenya. There are two components of the diaspora in Kenya: the trader, the Dukawala, and the indentured laborer, the coolie. And the histories of their respective appearance from 1895 onwards and before, as Nilufer has mentioned, and as Anuradha mentioned. But this lecture is restricted to the coolies and further focuses on only one aspect of their achievement, a part which is hardly known and even lesser studied. And this is the role of the diasporic Indian coolies as builders of the civic infrastructure of Kenya, the infrastructure of the first towns. And that is opposed to their well-known role as builders of the railway. The role of the diasporic Indian coolies as builders of the civic infrastructure has suffered erasure, despite the extensive writing on the Uganda Railway. But in addition to the track, other infrastructure was also being built by the coolies. And the following are details of those other infrastructures. Firstly, the station buildings. The railway had 41 railway stations from Mombasa to Kisumu on the lake. 41 stations were built with booking and telegraph offices, and where required, goods sheds and stores were built. The principal buildings were at the terminal at Mombasa and Port Florence, that is the first name of Kisumu, and at Nairobi, which was the headquarters of the railway. Other major stations were at Voi, which is 100 miles up country, and at Nakuru, 420 miles, and finally, before Kisumu at Muhoroni, 500 miles up the line. You can see 100, 200, 300 like that, because the railway paused at each 100th mile. And these were also major engine changing stations. That is where both the engine and the crew changed, needing additional buildings. Mombasa, Kilindini, Nairobi, and Kisumu station buildings were built of stone, but all the other station buildings were of timber, what we call wood and iron, corrugated iron structures. The second lot of buildings were workshops and store buildings. The principal repair and engineering workshops were built at Nairobi. Smaller workshops were also built for petty repairs at Kilindini and Kisumu, the latter being the better equipped for carrying out any urgent work on the lake steamers. Thirdly, staff quarters were major projects. These included: 1, houses for the station masters, telegraph operators, clerks, and station staff at each station. 2, a house every 4 miles along the line to accommodate 16 men belonging to the maintenance gangs. These were called gangers' huts. So 41 every 4 miles, and there were 582 miles along the line, which gives a number of 145 structures. Number 3, quarters for the accountants, clerks of the headquarters, and several departments of the headquarters: general manager's department, accounts department, audit, traffic, locomotive, and stores. Number 4, and I quote, and a point to remember: offices for the foremen and other petty supervising staff. I'll come back to that. Number 5, houses for the artisans and mechanics employed in the workshops. 6, houses for the officers and crews of the steamers when in port at Kisumu. Number 7, houses for the general manager and heads of the engineering, accounts, audit, and traffic departments. This is Nairobi. Houses for the drivers, guards, firemen of the locomotive department, in which my grandfather worked, and lived in those quarters successively in Voi, Makindu, and Nairobi. Number 9, small hospitals at the changing stations and a general railway hospital at Nairobi. The record shows that the quarters provided accommodation for as many as 3,000 persons. Additional, number 10, specialized structures were built for the engine sheds. Engine sheds with pits for examining and cleansing engines, water tanks, water columns, wells, pumps, turntables, carriage sheds, signals, points, crossings, weigh bridges, and waterworks where the sources of supply were distant. We were passing through a desert just outside Mombasa up to Voi. Engine sheds were therefore necessary at Kilindi, Nairobi, and Kisumu, as well as the changing stations I mentioned at Voi and Makindu. Carriage sheds at the 3 main stations were built to stable the passenger carriages. Turntables or substitutes for them, triangles, at all engine stations, signals and points, crossings at every station, and water supply, which was otherwise sent by water train. At Nakuru, in the Rift Valley at mile 420, a secondary headquarters was built. The houses and offices necessary for divisional offices, replicating Nairobi. In addition, the coolies built the iron Salisbury Bridge, over 3/4 of a mile long, joining Mombasa Island to the mainland. The interim incline to the eastern Rift Valley floor, 35 iron viaducts in the western Rift Valley escarpments, 280 smaller bridges and culverts. In these extensive tasks, the Railway Administration recorded later, quote, when the Uganda Railway was built, the pickaxe, shovel, and the karai, the pan, in the hands of the laborers were the main implements. All this evidence is set out by the former chief accountant of the Uganda Railway, Benjamin Eastwood, in his lengthy article, Building Nairobi and Nakuru, published in 1909, when he had already retired from the railway. However, these details are not to be found in the final report of 1904, nor in the official history of the railway published in 1948. Eastwood's text, gathering as it does the various strands of the labor, reveals extraordinary civic construction achievements. Yet, this birth of Kenya's civic infrastructure has not been acknowledged, and certainly not to the extent or in the manner that the track-laying achievement of the coolies was, then and in the century that followed, in books, films, and railway legend. The conclusions we may draw then from these facts: one, for the past century, history has been disseminated on the basis that the official figure of 31,983 is a comprehensive figure of coolie recruitment, and therefore all the artisans who were recruited are included in that figure of 31,000. But number two, but Eastbrook's table in this article, his article, shows that this figure is not correct, and nor is the assumption that whatever the artisans built, the coolies built, and what the coolies built includes whatever the artisans built. The number of laborers in Eastbrook's table is as follows. I will read the first column. And he says the number of artisans and laborers engaged year by year is shown in the following table, from 1896 to 1903, when the line opened. Number one there is number of laborers imported at end of each year. And the total figure is not 31,000, it's 35,733. So that there is a difference in the official history record and Eastwood's table. And this reveals who the authors were of the civic construction, this extensive civic construction which we have just seen, as contrasted to the laying and the plate laying, it's called, of the track. And these were the indentured artisans from India. Number three, the railway's history has also been disseminated without identifying this construction of the first civic superstructure as a separate and distinct achievement. Mombasa city by then was already 1,000 years old, but it was the only pre-existing city on the route of the construction. There were no towns or even settlements at the remaining 40 stations. Yet, from these first seminal buildings grew 40 of Kenya's townships and cities, including Nairobi, including Nakuru, including Kisumu, today Kenya's first, third, and fourth largest cities. So this history has therefore also been recorded without sufficiently identifying these artisans as the authors of the first colony-wide civic constructions. 5. Further, these official histories have also been recorded and disseminated without acknowledging that in addition to coolies and artisans, now this is a new category, the indentured labor also included a separate and distinct category of workers who were key contributants to the extraordinary reliability and success of the labor of the project. Embedded in his text on the housing, which we looked at earlier, I had pointed out, keep in mind his mention of the discrete presence and definition of this other category, and that category is the petty supervisory staff. All these omissions constitute erasure, the removal from history and memory of peoples. The petty supervisory staff are not identified or classified in the final report of 1903 and 4, nor in the official history 1947. Apart from the magnitude of the building construction, we are able to further confirm the active role of this petty supervisory staff in recently acquired photographs of the time. These photographs were taken in 1898 at Kilindini and Savo during the man-eaters period by one of the assistant engineers there. And this album, which is recently in the possession of a collection, private collection, in this album are photographs of foremen sitting as a group of foremen, 2 artisans in their workshop at Kilindini with the workshops, and 3 a mobile workshop which moved with railhead as it advanced. This further establishes that the engineers were using foremen and other sub-managerial ranks, the petty supervisory staff mentioned by Eastwood. Their names are not recorded. Fortunately, we can trace at least 2. Babu Purushottam Harji Parmar, overseer and clerks of works at Savo, and a second one at Savo, Roshan Mistry, son of Kader Mistry Baksh, native of Chajanlat village, Dakhel Post Office, Dumley, district of Jhelum, Punjab. And it is a necessary part of our scholarship that we gather these names so very casually thrown in very disparate accounts where there's no record. We may contrast now a similar legacy in the agricultural sector in Kenya. There, this legacy of building in agriculture, of the first building in agriculture, is detailed by name and record and pointedly given to another group, and this is continuously repeated. The omission of the artisans' authorship of the first civic infrastructure in the towns is in sharp contrast to the all too frequently reiterated authorship of the construction of the first farms and ranches in Kenya. This has been repeatedly credited to the white supremacist settlers, who constantly use that as a political argument for self-rule. No equivalent credit in respect of the towns and townships has been extended to the indentured artisans. In the presence of all this, we may be forgiven for concluding that the erasure was occasioned consciously. The credit to the artisans is long overdue. The artisans who built 40 towns in a country can say on behalf of each of themselves what was said in Hamlet. Quote, "I have some rights of memory in this kingdom, which now, to claim my vantage, doth invite me." These rights require acknowledgement because this memory makes nonsense of the continuous portrayal in white settler writings and political memoranda of unskilled, not to mention unhygienic, enlisted hordes, fit only to operate as immediately directed by superior beings. It also explodes the white supremacists' claims of an unskilled labor force to whom nothing more is owed. Allow me a brief diversion, but one relevant to the duty of scholars in this matter. The official documentation, as well as the colonial histories, say that these Indian workers, coolies and artisans, were imported to Mombasa. An immediate example is the very table we've just referred to, eastwards. It starts with that description for its first column, and it writes, number of laborers imported to end of each year. Import is a transaction reserved for goods and commodities, not human beings. When used in respect of human beings, the premise is that these beings are chattels, as in the notion of slavery and in the perverted treatment of slaves. This is even reflected in the legal definition of slavery in your law and ours. The Indian Penal Code, which we have copied here, used and still uses to the present the following words to describe the offense of slavery. Quote, any person who imports, exports, removes, buys, and sells any person as a slave, etc. Human beings cannot be imported or exported, save in the minds of those who disregard their humanity. Indentured coolies were legally not slaves, but were sadly too often not viewed differently by their employers or the administrations. During the century after the legal abolition in the British Empire in 1834 and the arrival in Port Louis at the Pravasi Ghat in Mauritius in 1838, neither language nor thought altered in respect of them as labor. Sadly, even Indian and diasporic Indian writers and academics even today still use the term when dealing with indentured labor. I request, do not let this dehumanizing word get into our writing and your minds. I do not appreciate it when I read that my grandfather was imported to Kenya in 1896 alongside jute sacks and cotton pieces. I have said that the coolies and the artisans have earned the rights of memory. They have done that firstly and simply by being our forefathers. Secondly, by the achievement itself. But thirdly, also by having paid an unagreed price. This was the human cost of their epic achievements. As we mentioned, 35,000 workers came from India during these years, 1896 to 1903, on their contracts. 2,493 died in the construction. This is 8% of the total labor force dying. It is a proportion which is wholly unacceptable in any construction contract, neither then nor now. That is, 4 workers died for each mile, and there were 582 miles. In conclusion, we can say, so with these facts and figures, we can join Bertolt Brecht to ask the same questions from a worker who reads. This is what he wrote. Who built Thebes of the 7 gates? In the books, you will find the names of kings. Did the kings haul up the lumps of rock? And Babylon, many times demolished, who raised it up so many times? Of Kenya, a British governor said it was the railway which created the colony. And the coolie asks, and who created the railway? Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Feroz Nauroji. It was a very moving part of a narrative of those times, and I feel indentured laborers played a crucial role in infrastructure development those days. And it is very important that the government should recognize and take cognizance to their contributions, to society and to development of those areas. And we would dwell on it more later after the three lectures are done and we have a Q&A session. So if you allow me, I move on to the next speaker. So announcing the short bio of our next speaker, Ms. Kanya Padeachi. Ms. Padeachi describes herself as a political and social activist who was involved in the anti-apartheid and teacher union movements through the 80s and 90s. She's currently engaged in community-based participatory research in early childhood development, ECD, towards a PhD. Her particular areas of research are integral education and the African indigenous knowledge value system of Ubuntu, both rooted in the interconnection and importance of the mind, body, heart, spirit, and community for caring, compassionate, and humane societies. Inspired to promote this paradigm of holistic human development, she and other like-minded colleagues established in 2016 the Center for Integral Education and Development, CIED, a non-profit organization for the advancement of integral education within a South African context. Kanya is a mentor in the Durban University of Technology Hub of the UNESCO Knowledge for Change project, which aims to include and build community partnership into research, primarily by honoring the knowledge that resides in communities. She has contributed journal articles and book chapters and presented widely at international and South African conferences on her work at the Gandhi Development Trust, where she managed its community-based early childhood development project, and on the aspects of her PhD research. Kanya, you are one more pearl amongst the speakers today, and welcome. We are really happy to have you with us. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anuradha. And greetings to all. Heartfelt thanks to the Indian Diaspora Centre, in particular, Professor Barucha and Kirti Rispur, and the University of Mumbai for inviting me to share thoughts on an aspect of the South African diaspora under the subject, the Indian Ocean as Memory Space. My presentation today on the trajectory of the South African Indian population's participation in the liberation of this country will follow broadly this plan. Starting with a brief introduction, it will give context to Indian settlement in South Africa, after which it considers Indian settlers' social integration into the new homeland as a forerunner to examining the political profile of Indians in South Africa. Then it describes the political evolution of Indians finding common cause with the African majority. Finally, it arrives at the conclusion of reflecting on Indians in the democratic order. So let me begin by declaring my own diasporic status as a second-generation South African of Indian descent, with my grandparents on both sides of my parentage having come from Mauritius. So had they not taken the decision to make the bold and daring plunge to put down roots in South Africa, although at the time the proposition may not have been unattractive, with a small already installed Indian community and a burgeoning economic boom post the discovery of the country's mineral wealth, without doubt, my own life story would be a very different narrative. I must admit, of course, that I'm not entirely averse to the fabulous island life that we know and love as visitors to it. In moving closer toward the subject of my presentation for today, I want to say how appropriately positioned this discussion is in South Africa at this time for two reasons. Firstly, and more broadly, 24th September in democratic South Africa is Heritage Day, formerly Shaka Day, in commemoration of Chief Shaka, who was a valiant warrior and founder of the Zulu Empire. In current times, the day and the entire month celebrate South Africa's roots, more especially its rich, vibrant, and diverse cultures. Thus, it represents an ideal opportunity to focus generally on Indian roots in this country, and particularly in response to this topic on the Indian assimilation into the country's social and political landscape. Secondly, and more directly germane to the topic, is the opportunity to try to understand one of the gruesome manifestations of the July uprisings that reared in some parts of this country, the purported antagonism between Indians and Africans amidst both direct and veiled references to a terrible history of conflict, suspicion, and racism between the two races. These horrible events in an insurrection 2 months ago between July 9th and 18th, and in the middle of the COVID pandemic, played out in spasms of violence and looting amidst a total collapse of law and order. Existing divisions, more especially those of race and class, were exploited as hordes of people, mainly Africans, went on a rampage. This resulted in homes burnt to the ground, places of work wrecked, infrastructure destroyed, and food supply threatened. The failure, for whatever reasons, of the state to protect its citizens led to communities, mainly in suburbs, banding together and blocking non-residents from entering. The so-called protection soon and inevitably degenerated into vigilantism. Two mainly Indian suburbs were singled out and identified when some of their residents, who viewed all Africans as potential threats, began exerting excessive force and violent means to prevent them from passing through the illegally created barricades into the suburbs. The horrific consequences of the mindless and frenzied actions of these Indians, generally attributed to the racial antipathies of Indians against Africans, and in many quarters raising the specter of the 1949 riots in Durban, which we will come to later, were the deaths of over 100 people and numerous injuries suffered by mostly Africans. Perhaps we need to start to understand Indian settlement in South Africa by giving some context. In their paper entitled The Journey of Our Tribe, Naidu and Naidu 2021 point to Indian presence in South Africa predating the iconic 1860 settlement and beyond in the forms of Dravidian gold miners before the 1652 Dutch conquest of the Cape, and Indian slaves in 1684 during the Dutch colonial era. Our focus, however, is the well-documented mass movement in the second half of the 19th century, when Indians came to South Africa based on two categories: as indentured workers in 1860, and later as free or passenger Indians. The former came as a result of a triangular pact made up by the three governments, which directed the indentured Indians to work for the Natal colonial government on Natal's sugar plantations. The free Indians came to South Africa mainly as traders, alert to new opportunities abroad. These free Indians came at their own expense from India, Mauritius, and other places. A practice summarily ended in 1914. Between November 1860 and 1911, when the system of indentured labor was stopped, nearly 152,184 indentured laborers from across India settled in Natal. And after serving their indentures, the first category of Indians was free to remain in South Africa or to return to India. Over 70% of them chose to stay, and as such constitute the ascendants of the majority of present-day South African Indians. What then was the Indian settlers' level of integration into the country they chose to regard as home? The question of assimilation and its realizability must surely be considered in light of the active, though veiled, seeds of division sown by the colonizers, a common stratagem used in colonies to maintain dominance. Making sense of Afro-Asian tension, Mir 2000, argues that whatever the African's perception of the Indian was in 1860, in it must have been the sense, if not knowledge, that he had been brought by the white colonists to replace him, and to be used against him in ways that he did not immediately understand. Hostility, therefore, must have been one of the components in his approach to the new stranger. It was in the interest of the white colonists to fan this hostility, because any consolidation of interest between the two labor contingents would have been fatal in a situation where the ratio between white and African was in the region of 1:10. If the African bonded with the Indian, the ratio between white and black would rise in the vicinity of 1:20. Thus, she maintains that Indians and Africans were separated from each other, and in separation projected as dangerous to each other. They were at the same time within viewing distance of each other, so that they could be constantly reminded of the strange and different ways of the other. The use of African whipping boys on the sugar estates, the condemnation of a transgressing coolie to the Kaffir barracks where he could be terrorized and ridiculed as the master intended, the appointment of an Indian overseer over African mill hands, the use of African police to suppress Indian strikers, were all calculated to keep the two races violently divided. Presiding over it all were the stereotypes calculated to present each other with an adverse image of the other. Notwithstanding, Hunt, 1990, notes that Indians in Africa occupied an ambiguous position of being among both the exploited and the exploiters. Most who came under the brutal indenture system were very poor, while some in the smaller but more prominent group who came voluntarily in pursuance of business opportunities were quite rich. There also existed a very small modernizing Indian middle class, largely Christian, which during the next 2 decades would become increasingly influential. The well-documented and general disdain Indians expressed towards Africans, according to Hunt, was conspicuously demonstrated. For instance, in their petitions against the Natal Franchise Bill, the Indians complained that the bill would rank the Indian lower than the rawest native. In attempting to protect their own position, they believed they had to separate themselves from the native blacks. They wanted to present themselves with their long cultural heritage as among the civilized peoples. In their view, the blacks were not civilized, they were raw, a perspective manifest in Gandhi's earliest statements about Africans and the obvious distance from them. Indians in general had quite a bit of experience with Black people, but little of it contributed to deep intercultural understanding or laid a foundation for political cooperation. The leading merchants engaged Black laborers and rented to Black tenants. The small retail merchants sold trade goods in small shops and by peddling. Poor Indians lived in the slums side by side with Blacks. Few of these contacts would have led to close relations with Africans, a perspective, however, that Mir seems to counter. While she acknowledges that in many instances the emerging relations were that of Indian landlords and African tenants, resulting in explicit tensions, there was also a growing neighborliness, which was put to the test when African neighbors shielded Indians during the 1949 violence, a subject, as I indicated, we will get to in due course. Hunt points out that Indians frequently complained of being mixed in with natives in railway cars, lavatories, pass laws, and in other regulations. They sought a separation between themselves and the blacks. In fact, one of the first achievements of the Natal Indian Congress was the creation of a third separate entrance to the Durban post office. The first was for whites, but previously Indians had to share the second with the blacks. Though they would have preferred to enter with the whites, they were satisfied with achieving a triple segregation. Equally, when his civil disobedience began and Indians were jailed with the natives, Gandhi led protests over being with the given the native diet and about having to share cells with them. This sense of superiority was evidenced even in their self-serving representations to state authority. In the face of settler determination to establish white rule, all the non-white groups tried to go over the heads of the colonial governments to higher imperial powers. But the most successful in the strategy were the Indians, who could appeal both to England and to India. Unlike the colored and blacks, who are unquestionably Africans, the Indians were regarded as unwelcome guests, probably because of their haughty insularity. Besides, most Indians, including Gandhi, saw India as the real homeland, thus raising serious misgivings about assimilation at this time into the social fabric of the new homeland. How possible was political solidarity between Indians and Africans against the common enemy? Prefacing this discussion with an excerpt from the Black Man's History series 1939, cited in Naidu 1997, provides an insightful perspective. It reads, "The tragedy of the Indians' fight for freedom in South Africa lies in the fact that the leadership has always been in the hands of those who represented the merchants and traders, while the poor Indians, workers and peasants, though they have always suffered most in the struggle, have never been able to achieve leadership. The bourgeois leaders of the Indian community have been prepared to call in the assistance of the Indian workers and peasants. But in the end, they have always compromised with the white imperialists. They have failed to take up the fight for the demands of the workers and peasants. In particular, they have prevented the oppressed Indian masses of poor people from making common cause with the Zulus and other oppressed native people in South Africa. The notion of Indians making common cause, especially with the oppressed natives, was, it would seem, a big stretch, because in reality, Indians themselves were differentiated along lines of class, religion, kinship, and language from the time they first arrived as passenger Indians. The class composition became more complex as indentured laborers acquired the status of free Indians. In addition, mainly through trade and enterprise, a small number of Indians established themselves as an urban middle class. Thus, it is unsurprising that these fractures would play themselves out in political formations as well. According to Packer 2011, the Natal Indian Congress, established in 1894, was the principal political organization associated with the Indians, who, despite the collective reference, were far from being a homogeneous group. Comprising mainly merchants and the affluent class, the Natal Indian Congress's campaigns at the time were carried out to promote and protect their own vested economic interests, which became a common practice for a considerable period in the history of the organization. Thus, the separation between them and the Indian masses was entrenched to the extent that between 1890 and 1920, there appears no discernible common link. Swan, 1991, illustrates how between 1893 and 1914, Indian politics were crucially shaped by the social and economic stratification of the Indian population. Action by indentured workers on the estates, albeit spontaneous and individualistic, preceded organized political action. The fact that indentured workers lacked the resources needed to initiate organization, whereas traders were able to invest money and energy in political organization, played a key role in shaping the contours and emphasis of Indian political organization. Essentially, the Indian political community comprised only the highest strata of the population: merchants, petty traders, and Western educated white-collar workers. Moreover, the political community was predominantly male, and to date, little attention has been given to the historic role of Indian women in political struggles. Inevitably, the ideological basis of their politics was consistent with maintaining a relatively privileged position in the economic hierarchy. And at no time did Indian politics during the earlier period seek a radical transformation of the social order. As indicated, they emphasized their difference and a belonging to India. And while stressing the need to present a united front, Indian organizations remained exclusive, seeing the struggle of African and colored people as essentially separate. Of course, many writers also claim that there was no evidence that a common front amongst Indians, Africans, and colored people could have been formed in this country in the first decades of the 20th century. This individualistic approach is borne out in the political formations of the other non-white groups as well, owing mainly to the successive white governments' guileful contrivances that ensured racial polarization and militated against a cohesive front. Accordingly, the colored leaders in Cape Town established the African Political Organization in 1902, which comprised typically the educated elite. And although it hoped to represent all non-white Africans, its membership and interests were for the protection of the colored community first. Equally, the Chinese workers, similarly affected by anti-Asiatic legislation, waged a parallel struggle to that of the Indian indentured laborers until they became an ally during Gandhi's passive resistance campaign in the Transvaal colony in 1906. A move appearing to coincide with the shift in Gandhi's thinking towards demanding universal human rights instead of pursuing the narrow interests of a group of people. Although Swan indicates that this alliance was the only instance during Gandhi's 2 decades in South Africa, which included constituents outside the Indian community. According to Hunt, the political mobilization of the Indians came as a response to an attack on their voting rights. In Natal, nearly 400 Indians with property had the vote. But as soon as self-government was granted to the settlers in 1893, efforts were begun to strike off these voters. The Franchise Amendment Bill of 1896 prohibited any Indians from registering in the future, a threat that caused the merchants to ask Attorney Gandhi to stay. And around it was established the Natal Indian Congress, the first Indian political organization. Conversely, Naidu, 1997, argues that organized Indian political expression in Natal did not owe its origins to Gandhi. In fact, it predated his arrival in South Africa by several years. Gandhi was inducted into merchant politics as a hired representative at a time when there was an urgent need for a full-time organizer. His legal training, fluency in Gujarati and English, and ideological compatibility with the merchants rendered him particularly suitable for the task. The Natal Indian Congress and later the Transvaal British Indian Association, formed in 1894 after Gandhi's arrival, were the direct descendants of the pre-Gandhian Indian Committee set up to campaign against discriminatory measures. Eventually, Indians were drawn together as a result of racist exclusionary measures, resulting in the formation in 1920 of the South African Indian Congress to represent a single voice of the Indians. While Indians adopted a posture of racial superiority over Africans, African mobilization itself was being defined in a restructured and industrializing society, giving birth to a small modernizing elite, the petty bourgeoisie, whose political hopes were for assimilation into the modern European society. They grounded these hopes in Christianity, in the moral rhetoric of the British Empire, and in the law of the Cape Colony, where non-whites had the vote. For this purpose, they formed a number of political organizations in the late 19th century, most of a local and regional character. It was not until the 40s when a new generation of educated radicals began to stress class and racial unity as a goal that the shape of Indian political organization began to change. Since the 1930s, trade unionists and younger political leaders, many of whom had working class origins and were members of the Communist Party, had sought to challenge the conservative leadership of the Natal Indian Congress. The emergence of a new leadership coincided with a heightened consciousness among workers who embraced trade unions as a means of seeking redress at a time of adverse economic conditions. Indian trade union leaders were drawing in African members debarred from trade union rights. Evading laws whenever they could, the non-European United Front had established a common political platform. It was in this climate of emerging political cooperation between Indians and Africans that Indians became victims of African violence, instigated by whites whose resentment against Indians had reached breaking point after the exposure of South African racism at the United Nations. According to Mir, the Indian political link and negotiations between India and South Africa ended in 1946. With the passing of the long-threatened Land Act against Indians, instigating South African Indians to mount their third passive resistance campaign. In 1947, newly liberated India tabled the treatment of Indians in South Africa before the United Nations, thus proclaiming racism as an international concern. This was the genesis of the international sanctions against South Africa, which was bolstered by mounting pressure from the newly liberated African states. In consequence, whites held Indians and the local Indian satyagrahis responsible for the predicament of the white government. Mir argues that the blame apportioned to the Indians for the growing international isolation of white South Africa catalyzed in 1949 on the heel of the accession to power of the nationalist government, one of the most devastating outbreaks of mass violence in Durban, the location of the majority of Indians. In this tragic calamity, 142 people were killed, over 1,000 injured, shops, factories, and houses destroyed. A number of outraged Africans, triggered by an Indian storekeeper in the Durban market assaulting an African youth, fiercely targeted and attacked Indians to avenge the assault. While there was little evidence of direct white instigation, some indications existed of the marauding attackers being used as a weapon of violence and vengeance on behalf of whites against Indians. The arson, looting, raping, and killing continued over the weekend and subsided only after the Navy intervened. According to Indian leadership and observers at the time, the police had been slow in responding to the situation. Finally, a common front is proposed as a consequence of the brutal violence. The violence shocked the Indian and African Congresses to the extent that they committed to accelerate the process of working together. Presenting a common and united front, the two Congresses made joint appearances before a commission set up to investigate the causes of the riots. Together, they testified that there was no movement afoot of Africans against Indians, nor any African hostility against Indians. Also, that Africans had sacrificed their lives for Indians when they sheltered and saved many potential Indian victims. The violent eruption had brought the two Congresses to a sharp realization that matters had been left to run an unguided course for too long. As such, alliances already in the offing took on a far more meaningful momentum in the fourth passive resistance campaign in the country, the defiance of unjust laws. Political cooperation between Indians and Africans continued through the 50s. In the organization of the Congress of the People and in the treason trial that followed, the Indian accused were prominent. On the worker front, the South African Congress of Trade Unions came into existence, attracting both Indian and African workers in Durban. 1960 saw the banning of the African National Congress, the South African Communist Party, and the Pan-Africanist Congress, following the mass killings of protesters against passes at Sharpeville and the declaration of the state of emergency. Practically the entire executive of the Natal and Transvaal Indian Congresses were also banned. Black consciousness emerged as the most powerful challenge to white domination in the 70s, having the effect of consolidating a Black political force distinctly dissimilar to the racially affiliated Congress movement. Indian and African participation created a new generation of youth who were unequivocally neither Indian nor African, but Black. The movement drew in youth, women, cultural, church, dramatic, and community groups, but was, like all political activity against the white minority government, victim to state repression. A mass confrontation was imminent, and it happened in Soweto in 1976. The killing of children and the sustained turbulence of African youth forced the nationalist government to institute reforms in the mid-80s. The subsequent and infamous tricameral parliament, which gave ineffective representation to Indians and coloreds and excluded the Africans, was rejected by the vast majority of Indians and coloreds, and to the extent that they boycotted the preceding elections. The Natal and Transvaal Indian Congresses that had become dormant were revived and formed strong components of the new liberatory movement, the United Democratic Front. There were further arrests in the second treason trial, in which Indians stood accused alongside their fellow disenfranchised South Africans. The African youth had, in the meantime, taken over the political initiative and made the African townships literally ungovernable. Internationally, the Euro-American powers for the first time applied effective sanctions, forcing the nationalists to retreat. Apartheid was declared dead. The banned organizations were unbanned. Negotiations were set in place. And finally, the new non-racial South African democracy was installed. In closing, it must be said that many South African Indians participated fully in the drawing up of the new constitution and are today fully assimilated citizens in the country and committed to advance the democratic project. Admittedly, there are still those who regard themselves as a minority with the characteristic symptoms of foreboding and insecurities. If, however, South Africans of Indian descent are earnest about integration into a country that has graciously received them with the warmth and acceptance typical of African hospitality, then it behoves them and others who perceive themselves as minorities to be counted as part of the majority, with the same equanimity shown by Africans. Having witnessed the protection and safeguarding of the same parochial and narrow Indian interests in the early history of Indian settlement in South Africa, when assimilation was prohibited by the successive racist colonial and apartheid governments, the imperative is to avoid regressing into those unenlightened epochs. Historically, South African Indians, regardless of class, have had a fair deal, as did colored people and obviously the whites, at the expense of the majority population of Africans in their own country. As Naidu brings to notice that the apartheid planners were themselves engaged in a dual strategy of reform and repression. Thus, attempts were made to gain the cooperation of marginalized but minority groups by incorporating them in the apartheid system, most notably with racial hierarchies of opportunities and privileges, while simultaneously excluding the African majority even further. Thus, poverty, deprivation, and underdevelopment have always been the lot of mostly African people, a demographic that will only change many generations hence, and only with the collective acknowledgement and efforts of all South Africans. There can be no place for insularity of any social group in democratic South Africa. And as the recent explosion of violence unleashed against African civilians by some Indians demonstrated, racism and racists appear to be remnants of a heritage in need of transformation. In summing up the topic on the participation of Indians in the liberation struggle in South Africa, I want to use Badshaw and Sosker 2012 statement. They point out that akin to every other national group, some individuals gave their lives to end apartheid, while others collaborated with the regime. Some worked to overcome racial divisions, while many enriched themselves by exploiting other sectors of the oppressed. Some embraced and others rejected the racial or tribal identities promoted by the nationalist government. Versions of history that whitewash these intractable realities breed cynicism. They are often interpreted as an effort by members of one group to assert separateness and advance a narrowly self-serving agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanya. Such an insightful talk. It can be a part of an entire thesis, I feel. The trajectory which you drew, plus the recent clashes which you remarked on, the civil unrest, I think, one of its kind, post since the end of apartheid. It's a cause for concern because that means there has been a flashpoint which has led to the violent conflicts between the Blacks and the Indian origin South Africans. Both of them marginalized under the apartheid rule, both having fragile relationships in the past. And I think both have had a long history of being colonized. Somewhere, I think questions will come in after the third lecture. Somewhere, I think the collective social perceptions about the Indian origin citizens may be involved, which may be spurred by political vested interests. So I feel now it's a very good gathering today. The Indian diaspora should come together to engage and identify and work towards peaceful solutions and gradual change in perception. Perception is the key. And I think, as you mentioned as well, the racial superiority posturing by Indian origin Africans would probably not work. And it is very important that the feeling of assimilation, the feeling of being part of the generic society is very important because these are very, these are like vibrations which can be felt in the social fabric. So Kanya, it was a treat to hear you. And we will take the questions subsequent to the third talk. And introducing our third speaker, Dr. Sushila Gopal. Sushila Gopal is a Mauritian of North Indian origin. Her research was first on contemporary poetry written by women. So we have two poets today, Advocate Feroz and also Dr. Sushila amongst us. Then she moved to post-colonial literature. She has written on English poetry, on modern literary theories and criticism. She headed the English department at the Mauritius Institute of Education and now is a part-time lecturer at Open University of Mauritius. Her recently published paper includes those on diaspora studies and ecology. She is a life member of ASLE, that is Association of Studies of Literature and Environment. She has a special interest in history and has presented papers on Gandhiji. Her short stories are published in Mauritius, and some of her poems has been published in India. She visits India regularly and is a member of the English-speaking union in Mauritius. Dr. Sushila, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I will take my topic, and I am a third generation Mauritian, and I think that geography is very important in our perspective of looking at Indian diaspora in Mauritius. So geography has played a key role in the life of the Indian diasporans in Mauritius. First, it must be noted that Mauritius was an uninhabited island. It attracted seafarers and empire builders on their way to and from India. It is held that the Phoenicians visited our shores because they were interested in ambergris, that is, which was known as a floating gold and very useful as a fixative in perfume. Then came the Portuguese. We have two vestiges from them, the word pesetas and our local loaf parmesan, which is found in Goa and in Portugal, I would say only. So after the Portuguese came the Dutch in 1598, but they did not stay long. They used the island as a shipyard, and Professor Advocate Firoz mentioned Indians as shipbuilders. Yes. So the workers from India came here with the Dutch, most probably to build and repair ships. They exploited our ebony trees and relished the dodo, a bird not inclined to fly. The Portuguese and the Dutch did not stay long, but the French stayed for almost a century. They claimed the island in 1715, but they left it in 1810, being defeated by the British at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Hence, we see that the geographical position of Mauritius has played a great role in bringing over workers with different skills from different parts of India. This situation kept increasing in parallel with the growth of the European colonizers. It is interesting to note that from Dinarobin, the name given by the Phoenicians, it became Mauritius under the Dutch, became Ile-de-France under the French, and then became Mauritius again under the British as per the Treaty of Paris in 1810. By that treaty, the French settlers were to keep their religion, their language, and their culture, thus fertilizing the seeds of multiculturalism. This multiculturalism started in a substantial way when Indian workers from Pondicherry, Tamil Nadu now, and from other places also. The British brought over workers from Calcutta. Among these workers, there were Muslims and Hindus. Peaceful living, mutual respect has been maintained, and these are taught to children today, very early. Multiculturalism is inbred in Mauritians. The Indian workers of Hindu and Muslim faith adjusted to living side by side with people of Christian faith. Today, we can see a mosque adjacent to the temple held by the Tamil-speaking. My point is that Indian diaspora was formed mainly with workers, not coolies. This is a fallacy that has to be corrected. Some of the workers could have been in harbors, on the railway stations, but to step the word coolies in a general manner on the members of the Indian diaspora is not correct. Just as it is not correct to tag all the white population of Australia as convicts from the 19th century England. It is true that often after displacement, there is a period of silence. This has been noted among those displaced as a result of the partition in India or even after the World War II in England or in America. Just as post-coloniality is not similar in all areas, diasporic populations too. Each has its own particularities. Now, some Mauritians reveal the occupation held by their ancestors and the immediate circumstances that led them to leave India. They were not coolies, often young men seeking adventure. Many Indians came as traders from Gujarat. Many Muslims came as sailors. Many came from Punjab area to work in the prisons in Mauritius. Some Indians from South Africa, from South India, were converted. Religious conversion was used by Christian priests as a bribe for posts in the government, but majority resisted fiercely. Some, in order to resist this, had their Hindu names tattooed on their forearms. What happened in Mauritius? First, the colonizers needed craftsmen and skilled workers. So those brought over had to be such types, not coolies. Secondly, after the abolition of slavery, workers were needed in the sugar plantations. It happened that with 1857, following the first Indian War of Independence, many political groups were targeted by the British government. They were mostly composed of young people, and these were imprisoned, later transported. They were transported to the colonies. Amitabh Ghosh refers in a succinct manner to these people in Sea of Poppies. Some of these groups carried the names of their political groups and not their caste name. Now, those who participated actively in freedom movements were mostly strong people, young, physically, mentally, and emotionally strong, ready to fight for their freedom in India. So that's why they were brought over. So among those who were displaced to Mauritius, there were craftsmen, skilled workers, holders of small farms, impoverished after having planted cash crops. But they were not coolies. Vikram Seth talks about the position of small landowners in the Stable Boy. But it must be noted that some of them were married. In Mauritius, there were some Indian families, and fathers of these, of their daughters, were looking for young men among the newly arrived. They very often had two families. The newly arrived found themselves with two families. We have cases where the first wife in India and other members of the family joined the family in Mauritius. We also have cases where Mauritians have visited their ancestral home and have found people bearing strikingly close resemblances. Anyway, my other point is linked with the geographical position again of Mauritius. The Indian workers here I remember Advocate Firoz mentioned workers and craftsmen, artisans, and so on. The Indian workers were not totally cut off because of the facilities to travel, to go back to India. There were many who traveled between India and England and Europe. So Indians working in Mauritius could visit the homeland. There was a lot of traffic at that time between India and Europe. Mauritius had remained a port of call for these ships. The indentured workers could return to India after completing their 5-year contract as stipulated. Ideology of return as brought forward by Avatar Bra could be turned into a reality. The frequent visits to India helped the Indian diaspora to keep alive their ancestral culture, but also to learn about decolonization. The Indian freedom movement was closely followed here. And I can say we participated in the movement. As children, we were taught freedom songs. The Indian flag was used openly, and today I can say even defiantly. My third point is the fallacy concerning the living conditions of the Indian workers in Mauritius. There has been an attempt at saying that there was much suffering and they were treated as slaves. It's true, they were working very hard. The people who came here were strong. They quickly recovered from the sea travel. They appreciated the mild climate and the fertile land. And it must be said that they were provided with fairly good basic food. They didn't have the famine that you had in India. They were free after their working hours, which of course were long. They were free to practice their religion, open bedkas, that is afternoon and evening schools. There were some restrictions concerning inland movement, but almost all of them had gardens of vegetables, fruits, and could rear cattle, goats, poultry, which they could sell to the white population. So there was some suffering, but it was also a time where they could work and be happy. The fourth point is that the Indian diaspora did not take possession of land that was destined as compensation to those who were freed, to those of African origin. People of Indian origin bought their land with their savings, and they have legal documents to prove it. Extended families were the norms. Men who came along with brothers multiplied their capacity to acquire land. It had become fashionable to talk about having a sawang, large families with more hands. Progressively, we can say, the anti-Malthusian, Bosserupian interpretation can be brought in here. In their everyday life, there were instances where Indian diaspora retained their customs brought over from India in an almost intact way. People of Indian origin developed the culture of saving for security, of buying a plot of land and building a house. We perfectly understand Naipaul's Mr. Biswas Saving for the future is part of the life, and not making merry as soon as some money comes in. Now I move to the present day. Today, in many families of Indian origin, children have settled in Europe, in America, in Canada, in Australia. I can say that the Indian diaspora has consolidated its place in Mauritius, in politics, socially, and economically. We have strong commercial, cultural, emotional ties with India, but the ancestral home very often remains a place to visit. Very few girls married to Indians live in India. They come back here, just as the Mauritian boys, Mauritian young men married to Indian girls. There must have been some nostalgia in certain moments of life. At pre-wedding celebrations up to the 20th century, there were some people known as bilap singers. But on the whole, the Indian population, the Indian diaspora, while maintaining strong attachment to the ancestral home and its culture, they have also adopted Western ways. They have opted for the here and now. The umbilical cord is not cut, but new ways are adopted and hybridity is celebrated. We do have some mixed marriages. Indian diaspora in Mauritius has a specificity nourished by its geographical position, which today, when space is defeated by technology, the built-in and inbred values will surely survive. Mauritians who settle abroad do have multiple homes, as diasporic populations have, according to Avtar Bra. Recently, in a supermarket, I heard a Mauritian young woman on holiday here saying that she wanted to take back with her to Canada some curry powder, but she would like to take some made in Mauritius and some made in India. Hence, the Indian diasporans in Mauritius are resilient people. Diaspora is about space and travel and mobility. Mauritians who are settling abroad today will find different communities, as Janet Wilson and Klaus Stoffler says. There will be alternatives, communities, but then these people will be sharing certain values from a common ancestral home, India. Thank you. I would like now to use my...
Thank you, Dr. Sushila. So,
yes, I'd like to use my shared screen because I would like to thank the CoHaB. I'm trying to get my... sorry, I can't get my...
Kirti, do we have a project screen option?
I'd like to share my screen.
Yes, we do. I've made you co-host, Dr. Gopal.
Yes, I'm trying to share it. Okay, I thank you all. I thank CoHaB. I thank the University of Mauritius. I thank Professor Nilufar. And I thank Professor Majumdar, Kirti. I thank you for all the negotiations, the meetings, the call, the phone calls. And it has been great being with you. Thank you for receiving me. I would like to take up some words from Advocate Firoz Nauroji, because I see that he is making the distinction between, I think I've lost you all.
No, ma'am, we can see you. Yes, we can.
See you.
And for making the difference between workers, between laborers and artisans. So I think you're also going in that direction. You did talk about erasure. So I think there has been a lot of erasure. And after some time, people now are talking, and little by little, I hope these words will be, offensive words will be erased. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sushila Gopal. Indeed, it was endearing to hear that the umbilical link still remains with India, but you have the Mauritian Indian diaspora has
Still, so could we give our
yeah, sure.
final
So I
remarks?
would request Professor Niloufar to summarize, followed by the vote of thanks by our Kirti. So Niloufar, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Anuradha. I'm sorry to cut this short, but the Zoom platforms are in tremendous demand at all institutions. And we, as far as the Indian Diaspora Centre, the CoHaB Indian Diaspora Centre at the University of Mumbai is concerned, especially during the conferences that we held before the pandemic and now during the pandemic, the webinars and webcasts that we have held, we have tried to move further and further into interdisciplinary areas, politics, history, sociology, and also maritime studies. And this is the way to go, because diaspora literature by itself is a reflection of what takes place in the political spheres, what has happened historically, and what is happening within the social sphere, of the Indian subcontinent itself. So I'm very glad that we have had 3 speakers today who are specifically from different areas and have spoken about different areas, sociological, political, and cultural, and of course legal, as in the case of Advocate Firoz Nauroji. And we want to move along those areas more and more. I'm also happy that we have had diasporic presence amongst our audience from different parts of the world. The Indian diaspora is not just NRIs in the USA, but the Indian diaspora is composed of old and new diasporas in Africa, diasporas in Mauritius, and of course also the older diaspora in Fiji, which hasn't been part of our discussions so far, but we hope to include them in the future as well. And we also saw, we people in India, when we speak about diaspora and diaspora studies, whether it's from the literature point of view, or the sociological point of view, or the historical point of view, we look at it from our point of view, from the Indian point of view, and it was very, very educational today for us, and I'm sure for Professor Anuradha as well, to come across the diverse views within the diaspora itself, the diverse angles from which those diasporics look at themselves, their lives in their diasporic homelands, homelands, they are homelands now, we can hardly call them hostlands. There's which were voiced, and we want to take this forward, especially the Indian Ocean as a memory space, and include maybe leading to the Pacific, Indian Ocean and the Pacific, because and the Caribbean Ocean I mean, the Caribbean Sea, I mean, the Indian diaspora is spread out so far and wide, and we need all these opinions to be taken into account and need different disciplinary approaches to be taken into account. So personally, I welcome all this and welcome all these new people on our platform from the Caribbean islands, and we hope to have further discussions with them as well. So please do not think that we do not welcome your opinions. All right, may I pass the baton to Anuradha to sum up.
Thanks, Professor Nilufar. And it was a wonderful talk by all our three panelists. And I would like to tell the audience that we Indians who are part of the homeland, and you who are there in faraway distant land, who have adopted and a country of birth in various parts, in various continents of the world, we should be together. There can be differences of opinions, they can voice their opinions. And as Professor Nilufar said, we welcome it. And indeed, it was an eclectic crowd, and I can see people have joined in from South Africa, Caribbean, other parts of Africa. And it was indeed a very, as Professor Nilufar said, for me also very insightful and such an enriching experience of hearing you all. So with this, I would request Ms. Kirti Rizbut to kindly deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Majumdar. Yeah, so first and foremost, am I audible? Yeah.
Yes,
First thank you. First and foremost, we would like to thank our speakers today for such erudite presentations. I enjoyed all three. Thank you very much. Professor Majumdar, thank you for accepting our invitation to chair this session, and to CEMAS for agreeing to collaborate with us on this webinar. And we look forward to having or conducting many more webinars in our mutual field of interest. Thank you so much. I would like to thank our University Computer Center for setting up this Zoom link, albeit with a clause of ending it in time. Yeah, but thank you, they've always been helpful. Thank you to Prasad from the UCC. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor of Mumbai University, Professor Pednekar, who has always been our support in all our webinars and endeavors, and to give approvals for setting up these meetings and webinars that we have to take from him in a timely manner. So thank you, sir. And last but not the least, all our participants who have attended the webinar. Some of you had said you may not have the time to attend, but who made it a point and took out some time to actually attend our webinar and contribute to it. So thank you very much. Thank